Okay, so today we're going to talk about something that's quite synonymous with photography. Not every image has to have massive amounts of it, contrary to what many people believe. A lot of people think that if an image isn't absolutely sharp, that it's worthless. No detail, throw it away. Sometimes you throw away an absolute masterpiece. So this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about detail. What exactly is detail? Obviously, we want to capture as much detail as possible, but in order to understand what is acceptable and what's not, we've got to understand a few things first. What it is and how it's created. So let's get right into it. This is detail. This is how to get the most of it. This is what it is. Enjoy. So a common mistake is that a lot of people think that detail and a high resolution sensor, a high megapixel sensor work hand in hand. Well, they kind of do, but it doesn't mean that you get an image full of the details you want just because you have a resolution. A large resolution camera doesn't necessarily mean that you get a lot of detail. There's a few things that go into that. Before we go into those things, let's understand what exactly detail is. We'll go into this at a later stage, but detail essentially is contrast on a micro level and on a global level. If you think about it, when we think of detail, we think of the lines between certain subjects, certain objects, even the textures within those subjects are made of lines. Those lines are separated by contrast of color. One will be slightly darker and lighter than the other, and that makes the line more definitive. If there's no contrast in color or in darkness and lightness, no line will be evident. So there's no detail. If an image is very soft, it'll mean that there's very little micro contrast in the image. So detail essentially is contrast from a micro level to a global level. Even having soft global contrast will make an image seem like it has more detail than if it had no contrast. There's a few things that can diminish the amount of detail in the image, and some of them are unavoidable, like in the conditions we shoot in. There could be heat haze. Those of you who've been to the Serengeti or the Masai Mara, anywhere where it's hot and there's usually a lot of distance between you and your subject, there is heat waves coming off the ground. Those disrupt the amount of detail, disrupt the image, they get in the way. And heat haze has a very negative impact on the amount of detail in your image. You can't avoid it. We don't have technology to see through heat haze. I don't think we ever will have technology to see through heat haze. Another thing that can quite often diminish the amount of detail we have in our camera is dust. Dust and even humidity in the air. If there's a big distance between us and our subject, these can take away detail. There's nothing we can do about it. Another thing that I know, and my heart bleeds for those of you who still struggle to afford good camera equipment, is a good lens. Good glass is probably your best weapon against losing detail. It really makes a big difference. I know there's a lot of people out there that say it's not about the equipment, you don't need good equipment to take a good picture. Yeah, and they're kind of right, but usually the people saying that are the people holding a $14,000 lens. Not all of us can afford a piece of equipment like that. And no matter what those people say, there is a big difference between a $14,000 fixed focal length lens and a bottom of the range $1,200 zoom lens f5.6 entry-level lens. There is a big difference. You can take the same picture on the same settings and the same body even, and you can end up with two quite different pictures in terms of detail, one capturing quite a lot more than the other which captures a little bit less. Now, in saying that, we must remember that a good composition always beats detail. Like I said in the beginning, quite often two people get pedantic about detail. I don't have enough detail. Off to the bin it goes. That's a tragic mistake when it comes to the idea that composition is the most important aspect of an image. You think about the greatest paintings that have lasted the ages, Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, the Mona Lisa. They're paintings. Yes, there's a lot of detail, but compared to camera that can capture details in the modern world, it doesn't have a lot of detail, but it was the composition, it was the emotion that mattered, it was what it represented. So don't throw an image away just because it doesn't have enough detail. Don't throw away your photographic career because you can't afford a $14,000 lens. You can still create absolute works of art. If your composition is sound, your storyline is clear, you can make works of art. One of the most common reasons we lose detail, contrary to what a lot of photographers will say, is simply because our camera settings aren't set correctly. There's a number of things that can diminish detail in terms of our camera settings. Our ISOs can be too high, which means a lot of noise is generated. Noise replaces detail. It starts to diminish detail. So that can be one thing. Our shutter speed might be too low. If our shutter speed's too low, what's going to happen? We're going to have a blurry image. Quite often, the first thing you need to look at if you've got an image that doesn't have as much detail, you look at it, oh shit, doesn't have enough detail, is look at your camera settings, look at the scene, because more often than not, there's going to be a way in your camera settings to just grab a little bit more detail out of that scene. So yes, in-camera settings are quite often the first place we need to look. And in fact, tackling your detail issue in camera first is your best weapon against the loss of detail. One of the first things I like to suggest to photographers in the field is have a way to stabilize your camera. We get lazy these days. Camera shutter speeds can go up to 1/8,000th of a second, and you think, it's so fast, I can shoot handheld the whole time. And quite often you can. It's a gift. Sometimes we don't have the luxury of having a tripod or something stable. But where possible, and I've done this mistake too many times, is I've assumed that because I've got a fast shutter speed, I can shoot handheld wherever. And I'm running around in a Jeep shooting handheld when there's beanbags literally sitting on the floor next to me and I don't use them. Only when you look in post-processing and you zoom right up into the face of your subject, you're going to notice you've lost a lot of detail. That microsecond that the shutter stayed open, you were moving, and you've lost those micro details, the very finest details. You want to keep those fine details, stabilize your camera. Use a beanbag, use a tripod, use a jacket, use a backpack, use something to get your camera as stable as possible. That is your first defense against the lack of detail. Another thing that's often the reason, and I've done it a few times too, where you take a picture and you look at the eyes of your subject and they're blurry and you want to throw your camera into the river, is you haven't had a precise focal point. Now this can be a few things. Most of the time, it's human error. You've missed the focal point. Your focal point's been on the nose where it should have been on the eyes. You've lost detail. You can't get those details back in that case. It is blurry. Another reason for that could be your calibration of your camera, especially in lower end lenses. Quite often, your actual focal point is missing where your camera says it is on the focal point through your viewfinder. So you think you're focusing on the eyes, but the lens's calibration is off and you're actually focusing 2 inches behind the eyes. So you've got to check the calibration of your camera. And if the same result keeps coming up, you've got to send your lens in to get calibrated. So that's some of the ways we can battle the loss of detail in camera. And that's the most effective ways. We can extract details in post-processing, but it's to a very limited extent. The trick is to get it right in your camera first. Another thing we need to talk about is post-processing detail. Adding detail at a later stage. The first thing we need to talk about when we talk about this is in-camera sharpening, something we must never do. When you shoot in a JPEG, it actually comes with in-camera sharpening. That's why it looks so good. People shoot in a JPEG and they go, oh, that looks good. Because our eyes are naturally drawn to areas of contrast. And like we've said, detail is contrast from a micro level to a global level. The problem about in-camera sharpening is it's done indiscriminately throughout the whole frame. Not everywhere needs to be sharp. Take this seriously, because if you buy a $14,000 lens that shoots at 2.8, what that 2.8 gives you is a chance to have a very beautiful, blurry, milky background. If you shoot on JPEG or any kind of in-camera sharpening, you've now added details into that background. You've taken your $14,000 and put it in the bin. You might as well have bought a $1,200 zoom lens. That's what you do when you do in-camera sharpening. It's that severe. Stay away from it. It's indiscriminate and it exemplifies blemishes. Places that shouldn't have a lot of detail now have a lot of detail because the camera doesn't know what to sharpen and what not to sharpen. Where we can add detail effectively in post-processing is actually in our editing software itself. And this is a very useful tool. And it comes in the form of filters, of gradual types, radial filters, and brush filters, where we can actually add details. We can add sharpening selectively to specific areas. We don't really want our background to be sharp and full of details. And these filters in programs such as Lightroom allow you to add sharpening and details to your subject only, and even remove details from your background. Which means if you're clever and you only have a $1,200 lens and you shoot at f5.6, you can actually give it that f2.8 look. And that's a video for another time that I'll post. We also have the means in Lightroom to adjust details on every single level, from micro details to global contrast, through various sliders. We must remember that detail is contrast. So the contrast slider itself, even though it's global contrast, on quite a large scale, is still adding a certain amount of detail to the image when you add contrast. When you add clarity, it's at a smaller level than contrast, a little bit more micro, bigger edges of buildings, edges of your subject, is adding contrast, micro contrast to those edges. Texture, again, we're going even smaller. Smaller details now have more contrast, which means they have more clarity, which means they have more detail, all the way down to sharpness itself, which allows us to target the very finest of details inside our image. And this is a very useful tool to adding detail to the image without exemplifying blemishes, without exemplifying details that we don't want to have more detail. So the art of sharpening in post-processing is very important and can really aid to adding details to an image where we want them specifically. So it's worth knowing exactly what detail is, how it appears in certain levels of contrast, from global to micro contrast, and how to get the best out of it, best from shooting in the field to best in post-processing. And at the end of the day, you'll be left with a very beautiful image.